Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This is not simply a story about a pill. This is not merely a tale of chemistry and pharmacology, of laboratories and prescription pads. No. What you are about to hear is the story of how a tiny tablet, no larger than an aspirin, reshaped the emotional landscape of an entire nation. How it entered medicine cabinets in suburban homes across America and stayed there for decades. How it promised peace but delivered something far more complicated. How it made one pharmaceutical company unimaginably wealthy while quietly creating millions of people who could no longer function without it. This is the story of benzodiazepines, of Valium and Librium and Xanax, of the quest to medicate human anxiety itself. It is a story of brilliant scientists and ruthless marketers, of suffering patients and overwhelmed doctors. It touches every corner of American society, from Hollywood starlets to exhausted housewives, from Vietnam veterans to Wall Street executives. By the end of this history, you will understand not only how these medications came to exist, but why they became the most prescribed drugs in the world. You will understand the shadow they cast across generations. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue creating these deep explorations of history's most fascinating and troubling subjects. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from tonight and what time it is there. I am always curious to know who shares these quiet hours with me, listening in the darkness. Now, phone away, distractions silenced. The world outside your door can wait. Tonight, we travel back through decades, through centuries even, to understand how humanity has always searched for relief from the burden of fear. Let us begin. Our story begins not in a laboratory, but in the human heart, in that quickening pulse you feel when danger approaches, in that tightness in your chest when you contemplate an uncertain future. Anxiety is as old as consciousness itself. It is woven into the fabric of what it means to be human, to be aware that we exist and that we will someday cease to exist. Every civilization that has ever risen and fallen has grappled with this fundamental unease. Every culture has sought remedies. In the ancient world, the first chapter of this story takes us to the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the Sumerians cultivated a remarkable plant with milky white sap. They called it whole gill, the joy plant. We know it today as the opium poppy. 5,000 years before the birth of Christ, humans had already discovered that nature offered substances capable of dulling pain and quieting troubled minds. The Sumerians passed their knowledge to the Babylonians, who passed it to the Egyptians, who ground poppy seeds into elaborate preparations for their pharaohs. Across the ancient Mediterranean, the Greeks developed their own understanding of mental distress. The physician Hippocrates, writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, described a condition he called melancholia, a darkness of the spirit that we might today recognize as depression or anxiety. He believed it arose from an imbalance of bodily humors, from too much black bile accumulating in the spleen. His treatment involved diet, exercise, bloodletting, and careful administration of herbal remedies. Among these remedies was the root of the valerian plant, a flowering herb with small pink blossoms and a distinctly unpleasant odor. Valerian would remain in the European pharmacopoeia for the next 2,000 years, a testament to how desperately humans sought relief from their inner turmoil. The Romans, inheriting Greek medical knowledge, continued these traditions. The physician Galen, personal doctor to Emperor Marcus Aurelius, refined Hippocrates' theories and developed elaborate compound medicines. One of his most famous preparations was theriac, a paste containing dozens of ingredients, including opium, viper flesh, and various herbs. It was prescribed for everything from plague to anxiety to insomnia. Galen believed that mental disturbances had physical causes, a remarkably modern insight that would be forgotten and rediscovered many times over the coming centuries.
But here we must pause and acknowledge something important. The anxieties of the ancient world were different in kind from those that would later afflict modern humanity. The Roman citizen worried about crop failures, about barbarian invasions, about offending the gods. These were tangible fears rooted in the material realities of life. The anxiety that would later fuel the benzodiazepine epidemic was something new, something born of industrial civilization itself, a nameless dread, a sense of being overwhelmed by the pace of change, a feeling of isolation despite being surrounded by millions of other people. That particular form of distress would not fully emerge for many centuries. Through the long medieval period, knowledge of sedative substances was preserved primarily in monasteries, where monks copied ancient texts and tended elaborate herb gardens. Valerian continued to be prescribed. So did hops, the same plant used to brew beer, which was recognized for its calming properties. Lavender oil was applied to temples to ease headaches and promote sleep. These remedies were gentle, often ineffective, but rarely dangerous. The second chapter of our exploration reveals how the Renaissance changed everything. As European powers began their age of exploration, they encountered new cultures and new substances. Portuguese and Spanish sailors brought back detailed knowledge of opium use from Asia. The Swiss physician Paracelsus, working in the early 16th century, dissolved opium in alcohol to create a preparation he called laudanum. This brown, bitter liquid would become the first widely available and genuinely effective treatment for anxiety and pain in Western medicine. It was also profoundly addictive, a fact that would not be fully understood for centuries. Laudanum spread through European society with remarkable speed. By the 18th century, it was available without prescription from any apothecary shop. It was given to teething infants to quiet their crying. It was administered to factory workers to dull the misery of their labor. It was especially popular among women of the upper and middle classes, who were expected to remain calm and composed despite lives of often suffocating restriction. The portrait of the Victorian lady reclining on her fainting couch, reaching for her bottle of laudanum, became a cliché because it was so common. However, the 19th century brought a reckoning. As scientific medicine began to develop more rigorous methods, physicians started documenting the terrible consequences of opium dependence. Patients who had taken laudanum for years found themselves unable to stop. When they tried, they experienced agonies of withdrawal, sweating and shaking and retching, their bodies having become so accustomed to the drug that they could not function without it. The medical journals of the era are filled with case reports of respectable citizens reduced to desperate addicts, spending their fortunes on opiates, lying and stealing to obtain more. The response of the pharmaceutical industry was to search for alternatives. Surely there must be substances that could calm the nerves without creating dependence. Surely chemistry could improve upon nature. This optimism would drive drug development for the next century and a half, and it would prove both partially justified and tragically naive. In 1853, German chemists first synthesized a substance called bromide. Within a few years, potassium bromide was being widely prescribed for what doctors then called nervous conditions. It seemed miraculous. Patients who had been agitated and sleepless became calm and rested. The drug was inexpensive to produce and appeared to work for almost everyone. Bromide salts became the first truly mass-market sedatives, sold in patent medicines and prescribed by physicians across Europe and America. But bromides had a shadow. Patients who took them for extended periods developed a characteristic syndrome. Their speech became slurred, their movements grew uncoordinated, their skin erupted in disfiguring rashes. Some experienced terrifying hallucinations. A few slipped into coma and died. What had seemed like salvation revealed itself as another form of poison. Still, the search continued. The year 1864 brought another compound into existence. Adolf von Baeyer, a German chemist who would later win the Nobel Prize for his work on dyes, synthesized barbituric acid by combining urea from animal waste with malonic acid from apples. The substance itself had no medical applications, but it would spawn an entire family of derivatives that would dominate psychiatric medicine for decades. These were the barbiturates, and they would prove both tremendously useful and tremendously dangerous. The first medically useful barbiturate was phenobarbital, introduced in 1912 under the brand name Luminal. It was marketed as a treatment for epilepsy and as a sedative for the anxious. Unlike bromides, it did not cause rashes or obvious mental deterioration. It worked quickly and reliably. Doctors embraced it enthusiastically, prescribing it in ever larger quantities for an ever-widening range of conditions. Through the 1920s and 30s, pharmaceutical companies developed dozens of barbiturate variants, each supposedly safer or more effective than the last. Secobarbital, pentobarbital, amibarbital. They went by brand names that suggested peaceful sleep: Seconal, Nembutal, Amitol. They were prescribed for insomnia, for anxiety, for surgical anesthesia, for the treatment of psychiatric disorders. They were also increasingly abused. Movie stars swallowed them by the handful. Jazz musicians called them goofballs and mixed them with alcohol for a dangerous intoxication. By the 1940s, barbiturate addiction had become a recognized medical problem. The darkest aspect of barbiturates was how easily they killed. The difference between a therapeutic dose and a lethal dose was terrifyingly small. A patient who took just a few extra pills while confused or despondent could slip into a coma from which they would never awake. Barbiturates became the preferred method of suicide for those who wanted to die peacefully in their sleep. They also became a favored tool for murder, difficult to detect in an era before sophisticated toxicology. Marilyn Monroe died with barbiturates in her system on that August night in 1962. So did Judy Garland 7 years later, and so many others whose names never made headlines. The obituary pages of mid-century America are filled with overdose deaths that were officially ruled accidents but may well have been intentional. The drugs that were supposed to bring peace too often brought permanent silence. By the late 1940s, the medical profession was acutely aware that they needed something better. They needed medications that could calm anxiety and promote sleep without the constant specter of addiction and fatal overdose. The race was on to find the perfect tranquilizer. Moving into the post-war era, we encounter a new landscape of pharmaceutical research. The Second World War had demonstrated the power of industrial science. Penicillin had saved countless lives. Radar had changed the course of battles. Nuclear physics had unleashed terrible energies. There seemed to be nothing that could not be accomplished through laboratory research. Drug companies invested heavily in systematic exploration of chemical compounds, searching for molecules that might prove medically useful. One of the companies leading this effort was Hoffmann-La Roche, a Swiss pharmaceutical giant founded in the 1890s. By the 1950s, they had established a major research laboratory in Nutley, New Jersey, a small town just outside of New York City. There, in a nondescript building that could have been mistaken for an insurance office, scientists worked to create new medications. Among these scientists was a man named Leo Henrik Sternbach. He was born in 1898 in Abacia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now the Croatian city of Opatia. His father was a pharmacist, and young Leo grew up surrounded by bottles and powders and the smell of chemical compounds. He showed early aptitude for chemistry and went on to earn his doctorate from the University of Krakow in 1931. As a Jew in Europe during the 1930s, Sternbach could see the darkness gathering. He secured a position with Roche's Swiss headquarters and later transferred to their American subsidiary, escaping the Holocaust that would consume so many of his relatives. Sternbach was a practical man, skilled at synthesis, but not particularly theoretical. He was assigned various projects over the years, working on vitamins and other compounds. In 1954, however, his supervisors gave him a new mission. They wanted him to explore a class of compounds called benzodiazepines, which early studies suggested might have sedative properties. "Find us something new," they told him, "something that works like the barbiturates but is safer." For 2 years, Sternbach and his small team synthesized compound after compound. 40 different molecules were created, tested on laboratory animals, and found to be inactive. The project was considered a failure. In 1956, Roche management ordered Sternbach to abandon this line of research and move on to other priorities. What happened next would change medical history. As Sternbach was cleaning up his laboratory, preparing to end the project, he came across a sample of one final compound that had been synthesized but never tested. It was labeled RO50690, a white crystalline powder sitting forgotten in a jar. Sternbach's assistant, Earl Reeder, suggested they submit it for animal testing before disposing of it. There seemed no harm in tying up this loose end. The results astonished everyone. RO50690 demonstrated powerful effects in mice. It calmed them without putting them to sleep. It relaxed their muscles without impairing their coordination. Most remarkably, it appeared to be extremely safe. Mice given massive doses survived without apparent ill effects. Here, finally, was something that worked differently from anything that had come before.
Sternbach had made a chemical error that turned out to be serendipitous. He had been trying to create one type of compound, but had inadvertently synthesized something entirely different. The molecule was not a benzheptoxydiazine at all. It belonged to a previously unknown class of chemicals that would come to be called benzodiazepines. The year was 1957. The pharmaceutical revolution was about to begin. Roche moved quickly to develop the compound for human use. They gave it the generic name chlordiazepoxide and the brand name Librium
derived from the Latin word for balance. Animal studies were followed by human trials, which confirmed the drug's remarkable properties. Librium reduced anxiety without causing excessive sedation. It relaxed muscles without producing paralysis. It seemed to have a wide margin of safety between therapeutic and toxic doses. Compared to the barbiturates, it appeared almost miraculous. The Food and Drug Administration approved Librium in February of 1960. Within a year, it had become one of the most prescribed medications in America. Doctors who had been frustrated by the dangers of barbiturates embraced the new drug enthusiastically. Patients who had suffered from what was then called nervous tension found relief they had never experienced before. But Sternbach was not finished. Even as Librium was conquering the American pharmaceutical market, he was synthesizing new variants of the basic benzodiazepine structure. One of these variants was designated R52807. In testing, it proved even more potent than Librium, requiring smaller doses to achieve the same effect. It also appeared even safer, with an even wider margin between therapeutic and lethal doses. Roche gave this new compound the generic name diazepam and the brand name Valium. The name was chosen to suggest valiance, strength, the ability to face life's challenges with calm courage. Valium was approved by the FDA in 1963. It would go on to become the most prescribed medication in America from 1969 to 1982, a reign of dominance unprecedented in pharmaceutical history. What came next would change everything. To understand how Valium achieved its extraordinary success, we must understand not just the medication itself, but the society into which it was introduced. The America of the 1960s and 70s was a nation in turmoil. The optimism of the post-war years was giving way to anxiety and unrest. The Kennedy assassination shattered a certain innocence. The Vietnam War divided generations. Urban riots, political scandals, economic instability all contributed to a pervasive sense of unease. At the same time, traditional sources of support were breaking down. Extended families that had once lived in the same town for generations were scattered across the country as Americans moved in search of economic opportunity. Religious attendance was declining. Communities were fragmenting into isolated nuclear households in anonymous suburbs. People felt alone with their troubles in ways their grandparents had never experienced before. Women, in particular, found themselves in an impossible situation. The post-war ideal of the happy housewife, content in her domestic sphere, was becoming increasingly untenable. Betty Friedan's groundbreaking book, The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, the same year Valium was approved, gave voice to what Friedan called the problem that has no name. Millions of women felt trapped in lives of stifling routine, their talents wasted, their ambitions suppressed. They experienced this entrapment not as political oppression, but as personal failure, as something wrong with themselves. Into this cultural moment came Valium, a small yellow pill that promised relief. The marketing genius behind Roche's campaign was a man named Arthur Sackler. He was not an employee of the company, but rather the head of a medical advertising agency that had developed revolutionary techniques for pharmaceutical promotion. Sackler understood that doctors were the gatekeepers of prescription medication. Win over the doctors, and the patients would follow. Sackler's advertisements for Valium appeared in medical journals across the country. They were sophisticated and subtle, speaking the language of science while appealing to deeper anxieties. One famous ad showed a young woman standing alone on a college campus. The headline read, "A Whole New World of Anxiety." The copy explained that the stresses of modern life produced legitimate medical conditions requiring medical treatment. Valium was presented as the rational, scientific response.
Other advertisements depicted overwhelmed housewives, stressed executives, anxious elderly patients. The message was always the same. These people are suffering from a real illness. You, the physician, have the power to help them. Prescribe Valium and their suffering will ease. The campaign was remarkably effective. What the advertisements did not emphasize was dependence. From the earliest days, there had been warning signs that benzodiazepines might not be as safe as initially believed. Some patients who tried to stop taking Librium or Valium found themselves experiencing withdrawal symptoms similar to those produced by barbiturates or alcohol. They became agitated, unable to sleep. Some developed seizures. A few died. However, these cases were initially dismissed as outliers. The pharmaceutical companies argued that dependence occurred only in patients who abused the medication, taking higher doses than prescribed or combining it with alcohol. Responsible use, they maintained, was perfectly safe. Many physicians accepted this reassurance without question. They continued prescribing, patients continued taking, the sales figures continued to climb. By 1975, Valium was generating $400 million in annual revenue for Roche, making it the first drug in history to achieve that milestone. One estimate suggested that in that year alone, American doctors wrote more than 50 million prescriptions for the medication. Adjusted for population, this meant that roughly 1 in 5 American adults was taking Valium at some point during the year. The cultural penetration was equally remarkable. Valium became a shorthand for the medicated modern lifestyle. The Rolling Stones released their song "Mother's Little Helper" in 1966, though it may have been inspired by the earlier barbiturates and meprobamate. The lyrics perfectly captured the image that would attach to Valium. A hurried housewife reaching for a pill to get through her busy day. The phrase became part of the language, a sardonic acknowledgement that something was fundamentally wrong with how people were living. The second chapter reveals how deeply Valium penetrated every layer of American society. In Hollywood, the medication was ubiquitous. Elizabeth Taylor spoke openly about her use of sedatives. So did Lucille Ball. Judy Garland, already dependent on barbiturates and amphetamines, added benzodiazepines to her chemical regimen before her death in 1969. The pressures of fame, the endless scrutiny, the impossible demands of maintaining a public image all seemed to require pharmaceutical assistance. But ordinary Americans consumed Valium in even greater quantities than celebrities. Suburban housewives took it to cope with boredom and isolation. Office workers took it to manage the stress of corporate life. Students took it before exams. Soldiers took it to calm their nerves before deployment to Vietnam and to quiet their nightmares after returning. The drug had become a solution in search of problems, applied to every form of human distress. Doctors were remarkably willing to prescribe. The pharmaceutical industry had successfully promoted the idea that anxiety and nervous tension were medical conditions requiring medication. A patient who came to a general practitioner complaining of worry, sleeplessness, or vague discontent would often leave with a prescription for Valium. The appointment might last only a few minutes. There was little discussion of alternative treatments, of psychotherapy, or lifestyle changes. A pill was simpler. A pill was scientific. A pill was what modern medicine offered. We must pause here to consider the particular situation of women in this era. Studies consistently showed that benzodiazepines were prescribed to women at roughly twice the rate they were prescribed to men. This disparity reflected deep-seated assumptions about gender and mental health. Women were seen as naturally more emotional, more prone to nervous complaints, more in need of chemical assistance to manage daily life. The very real stresses they faced, from discrimination to domestic violence to the crushing burden of unpaid caregiving, were medicalized and individualized. "Take this pill," the medical system said. "You will feel better." The third chapter of our story takes us through the decade of the 1970s, when Valium's dominance reached its peak. The drug had become so normalized that questioning its use seemed almost eccentric. Mothers gave it to their children to calm hyperactivity. Nursing home staff administered it to elderly residents to make them more manageable. Psychiatrists prescribed it for conditions ranging from depression to schizophrenia, despite lack of evidence that it helped these disorders. But the darkness was beginning to emerge. Throughout the decade, reports accumulated of patients who had become trapped in benzodiazepine dependence. These were not drug abusers or irresponsible patients. They were ordinary people who had followed their doctor's instructions, taking prescribed doses for extended periods, only to discover that they could no longer function without the medication.
The mechanism of dependence was becoming clearer. Benzodiazepines work by enhancing the effect of a neurotransmitter called gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, which inhibits brain activity. When the brain is regularly exposed to benzodiazepines, it compensates by reducing its sensitivity to GABA. The patient needs higher doses to achieve the same effect. When the drug is removed, the brain is left in a hyperexcitable state. The result is withdrawal syndrome, characterized by anxiety far more severe than whatever the patient originally experienced, along with insomnia, tremors, and potentially life-threatening seizures. How did this happen? How did millions of people become dependent on medication that was supposed to help them? The answers lie in the complex interplay of pharmaceutical marketing, medical culture, and human psychology. Doctors trusted the reassurances of drug companies. Patients trusted their doctors. Everyone wanted to believe that there was a simple solution to the complex problem of human suffering. Individual stories from this period reveal the human cost behind the statistics. Consider a woman we might call Mary, though that is not her real name. She was a school teacher in Ohio, 43 years old in 1972, married with 2 teenage children. She had always been somewhat anxious, prone to worry, but she had managed well enough. Then her mother died after a prolonged illness. Mary found herself unable to sleep, unable to concentrate, overwhelmed by grief and the demands of daily life. Her doctor prescribed Valium, 10 milligrams 3 times daily. The relief was immediate and profound. Mary could sleep again. She could teach her classes without feeling that she would collapse from exhaustion. She was grateful beyond words. She continued taking the medication for months, then years. Whenever she tried to reduce her dose, the anxiety returned with terrifying intensity. She would wake in the night drenched in sweat, her heart racing, convinced that something terrible was about to happen. Her doctor advised her to continue the medication. After all, it was working. Why change what worked? By 1978, Mary had been taking Valium for 6 years. She had gradually increased her dose as the original prescription became less effective. She had tried multiple times to stop and failed each time.
She did not feel like herself anymore, not really. She felt dulled, distant from her own life, as if watching everything through a pane of glass. But she could not imagine stopping. The alternative seemed worse. Mary's story was repeated, with variations, millions of times across America and around the world. The precise number of people who became dependent on benzodiazepines during this period is impossible to determine, but estimates suggest it was in the millions in the United States alone. Many of them were women, many were elderly. Most had no idea that the medication they took faithfully every day was changing their brain chemistry in ways that would make stopping extraordinarily difficult. While America was consuming Valium by the ton, the rest of the world was experiencing its own benzodiazepine revolution. In Britain, the National Health Service made these medications freely available to anyone whose doctor prescribed them. In France, they became known as anxiolytics and were consumed in enormous quantities. West Germany, Italy, Japan, Australia all saw similar patterns. The specific brand names varied, but the pharmacology was the same. Humanity was collectively attempting to medicate away its anxiety. The medical profession was beginning to have doubts, however. The first systematic studies of benzodiazepine dependence were published in the mid-1970s. Researchers documented cases of severe withdrawal syndrome, of patients who had taken prescribed doses and nonetheless developed physical dependence. These findings were controversial. Many doctors simply did not believe them. The pharmaceutical companies certainly disputed them, but the evidence continued to accumulate. In 1979, Senator Edward Kennedy held congressional hearings on the benzodiazepine problem. Witnesses testified about the widespread overprescription of these medications. They described patients who had become dependent after following medical advice. They questioned whether pharmaceutical marketing had distorted medical practice. The hearings produced headlines, but little concrete action. The tranquilizer industry was too powerful, too profitable, too deeply embedded in American healthcare. As we approached the 1980s, the landscape was beginning to shift. Valium's patent expired in 1985, allowing generic manufacturers to produce cheap diazepam. This reduced Roche's profits, but did not reduce consumption of the drug. Meanwhile, a new generation of benzodiazepines was entering the market. These medications were supposedly improvements on the original, faster acting or shorter lasting or more precisely targeted.
The most significant of these new drugs was alprazolam, introduced by Upjohn Pharmaceuticals in 1981 under the brand name Xanax. It was specifically marketed for the treatment of panic disorder, a diagnosis that had only recently been codified in psychiatry. Xanax was more potent than Valium, milligram for milligram, and it acted more quickly. For patients experiencing acute panic attacks, it provided almost instantaneous relief. This speed of action was part of its appeal and part of its danger. Xanax produced a rapid onset of effect that patients found profoundly rewarding. The relief from panic was so immediate, so complete, that taking the medication became powerfully reinforcing. But Xanax also wore off more quickly than Valium, meaning that patients needed to take doses more frequently. This pattern of repeated dosing throughout the day was particularly conducive to dependence. By the mid-1980s, Xanax had become the most prescribed benzodiazepine in America. The company that made it insisted it was safe and effective for long-term use. But the same pattern was repeating. Patients who took Xanax for months or years found themselves unable to stop. Withdrawal from Xanax was, if anything, more severe than withdrawal from Valium,
characterized by rebound anxiety, tremors, and seizures. The medical profession was slowly acknowledging the problem. In 1988, the American Psychiatric Association issued guidelines recommending that benzodiazepines be used only for short-term treatment, generally not exceeding 4 weeks. Similar recommendations came from medical authorities in Britain and elsewhere. The drugs that had been freely prescribed for decades were now being recognized as dangerous for long-term use. But changing prescribing practices proved difficult. Patients who had been taking benzodiazepines for years could not simply stop. Doctors who tried to taper their patients off these medications often encountered fierce resistance. The patients felt terrible when they tried to reduce their doses. They blamed their doctors for their suffering. Many demanded that their prescriptions continue. The cultural perception of benzodiazepines was also shifting. What had once been seen as sophisticated modern medicine was increasingly portrayed as a crutch, a form of chemical escape. The term Valium zombie entered popular discourse, describing patients who moved through life in a medicated haze. Feminist critics argued that tranquilizers had been used to suppress women's legitimate discontent, turning political problems into medical ones. Today, we still grapple with the legacy of the benzodiazepine era. The medications remain widely prescribed, though prescribing patterns have shifted. Doctors are more cautious than they were in the 1970s, more aware of the risks of dependence. But millions of Americans still take these medications, many of them for years at a time. The same patterns that emerged decades ago continue to repeat. The opioid crisis of recent years has drawn attention to the dangers of combining benzodiazepines with other substances. When opioids and benzodiazepines are taken together, the risk of fatal overdose increases dramatically. Both drug classes suppress respiration, and in combination, they can stop breathing entirely. Thousands of Americans die each year from overdoses involving both opioids and benzodiazepines. This lethal synergy was not fully appreciated until the 21st century, when overdose deaths began climbing to epidemic proportions. In 2016, the Food and Drug Administration added black box warnings to all benzodiazepines and opioids, cautioning against concurrent use. These warnings were long overdue. They represented an acknowledgement that these medications, prescribed casually for decades, carried real and serious risks. The modern understanding of benzodiazepine dependence has also evolved. Researchers now recognize that many patients develop both physical and psychological dependence on these medications. Physical dependence involves changes in brain chemistry that produce withdrawal symptoms when the drug is stopped. Psychological dependence involves a learned association between taking the medication and feeling relief. Both forms of dependence make stopping extraordinarily difficult. Withdrawal from benzodiazepines can be a prolonged and agonizing process. Unlike opioid withdrawal, which is acutely miserable but typically resolves within a week or two, benzodiazepine withdrawal can persist for months. Some patients report symptoms lasting a year or more. These symptoms include not only anxiety and insomnia, but also cognitive impairment, sensory disturbances, and a terrifying sense of unreality. Many patients feel that their doctors never warned them that stopping these medications would be so difficult. Medical guidelines now recommend that patients who have been taking benzodiazepines for extended periods taper off extremely slowly, reducing their dose by small increments over many months. Even with gradual tapering, many patients experience significant withdrawal symptoms. Some never fully recover. There are online communities of thousands of people struggling with benzodiazepine withdrawal, sharing advice and offering support. Their stories are heartbreaking. Consider the case of a woman named Jennifer who began taking Klonopin, the brand name for clonazepam, in her mid-20s for treatment of anxiety. Her doctor assured her the medication was safe and effective. She took it faithfully for 15 years, never exceeding her prescribed dose. When she decided to stop, she followed her doctor's tapering instructions. What followed was 2 years of hell. She experienced anxiety so severe she could not leave her house. She had panic attacks that felt like heart attacks. Her cognition was impaired to the point where she could not read or follow conversations. She lost her job, nearly lost her marriage, and contemplated suicide. Only after years of suffering did she finally begin to feel normal again. Jennifer's case is not unusual. The medical literature contains thousands of similar accounts. They represent a failure of the medical system, a failure to adequately warn patients about the risks of medications that were presented as safe and appropriate for long-term use. Why didn't anyone stop it? The question echoes through the decades. The answers are multiple and interconnected. Pharmaceutical companies had enormous financial incentives to downplay the risks of their products. Doctors trusted the reassurances they received from drug company representatives and medical journal advertisements funded by the industry. Patients wanted quick solutions to their suffering. Regulators were slow to act and often influenced by the industries they were supposed to oversee. There were also deeper cultural factors at work. The rise of the tranquilizer era coincided with a broader medicalization of human experience. Conditions that might once have been understood as normal responses to difficult circumstances, grief, loneliness, the stress of modern life, were increasingly reframed as medical disorders requiring pharmaceutical treatment. This medicalization was not entirely negative. It reduced stigma around mental health and provided genuine relief to many suffering people. But it also created a vast market for medications that promised more than they could deliver. The story continues to unfold in our present moment. Benzodiazepines remain among the most prescribed medications in the world. In the United States, roughly 50 million prescriptions are written each year. Many of these prescriptions are appropriate, providing short-term relief for acute anxiety or helping patients through difficult transitions. But many others represent the continuation of patterns established decades ago, with patients taking these medications for years, despite evidence that long-term use carries significant risks. New research has raised additional concerns about benzodiazepines that were not appreciated in earlier decades. Studies suggest that long-term use may be associated with cognitive impairment, particularly in older adults. There are indications that extended benzodiazepine use may increase the risk of dementia, though this remains controversial. The sedative effects of these medications contribute to falls and fractures in elderly patients, leading to significant morbidity and mortality. Despite these concerns, many patients continue to take benzodiazepines for years because they feel unable to stop. They have become dependent on the medications, physically and psychologically. Their doctors may not know how to help them taper safely. The medical system that created their dependence often fails to provide adequate support for recovery. The history of benzodiazepines offers lessons that extend beyond any single class of medication. It demonstrates how easily a culture can embrace pharmaceutical solutions to complex human problems. It shows how difficult it is to recognize the harms of widely prescribed medications until those harms have already affected millions of people. It reveals the power of pharmaceutical marketing to shape medical practice and patient expectations, and it underscores the importance of approaching new medications with appropriate caution, recognizing that early enthusiasm may not be justified by long-term experience.
Leo Sternbach, the chemist who discovered the benzodiazepines, lived to be 97 years old. He died in 2005, having witnessed both the triumph and the tragedy of his invention. In interviews toward the end of his life, he expressed complicated feelings about his legacy. He was proud of having created medications that had helped many people, but he was also troubled by reports of dependence and abuse. He had hoped to create something genuinely helpful, a safer alternative to the dangerous barbiturates. In many ways, he succeeded. Benzodiazepines are far less likely to cause fatal overdose than their predecessors, but they introduced new problems that Sternbach and his colleagues did not anticipate. The lesson is not that benzodiazepines are evil or that they should never be used. For some patients, they provide genuine and appropriate relief. The lesson is rather one of humility. When we intervene in the complex chemistry of the human brain, we often produce effects we did not intend. What seems like a solution today may become a problem tomorrow. The history of medicine is full of such reversals, of therapies embraced and later abandoned, of cures that proved worse than the diseases they were meant to treat. As we reflect on this history, we might also reflect on why anxiety has become such a defining feature of modern life. The benzodiazepine epidemic did not occur in a vacuum. It arose in a society characterized by rapid change, social fragmentation, economic insecurity, and a culture that offered few acceptable ways of expressing vulnerability or seeking help. The pills were popular because the suffering they addressed was real. The solution was inadequate, but the problem was genuine. Perhaps the ultimate lesson of the benzodiazepine story is that we cannot medicate our way out of the conditions that produce anxiety. The loneliness, the isolation, the frenetic pace of modern life, the sense that we are not enough and can never do enough. These are social and spiritual problems that require social and spiritual solutions. Pills can provide temporary relief, and that relief may sometimes be necessary and appropriate, but they cannot substitute for the deeper changes in how we live and relate to one another that genuine healing requires. The story of Valium and its descendants is, in the end, a story about the human search for peace. For thousands of years, we have sought relief from the burden of fear, from the anxiety that shadows conscious existence. We have used plants and potions, rituals and prayers, medicines and therapies. Some of these interventions have helped, others have harmed. Most have done some of both. The small yellow pill that ruled 1970s America was neither miracle nor monster. It was a tool developed by well-meaning scientists, marketed by profit-seeking corporations, prescribed by overworked doctors, and consumed by suffering people seeking relief. The story of how that tool was used and misused tells us something important about ourselves, about our vulnerabilities and our hopes, about the limits of technology and the enduring need for genuine human connection. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you might reflect on your own relationship with anxiety and the various ways you have sought to manage it. You might consider the ways our society encourages pharmaceutical solutions to problems that might be better addressed through other means. You might think about the people who became dependent on tranquilizers not through any fault of their own, but simply by following medical advice, and about what we owe them and what we might learn from their experience. The quiet of the night is settling in around you now. The weight of the day is lifting. Whatever worries followed you into this evening are beginning to recede, at least for a time. This too is a form of relief, this natural transition into rest, requiring no pill and no prescription. The body knows how to quiet itself when given the chance. The mind can learn to settle without chemical assistance. In the grand sweep of history, the era of the tranquilizers may come to be seen as a brief episode, a wrong turn that was eventually corrected. Or it may be understood as an early chapter in an ongoing story of pharmaceutical intervention in human consciousness, a story whose later chapters we cannot yet predict. Either way, it offers testimony to the power of our desire for peace and to the dangers of seeking that peace through shortcuts. The story continues. New medications are developed. New problems emerge. The cycle of hope and disappointment repeats. But human beings are remarkably resilient. We find ways to endure. We learn eventually from our mistakes. We develop better solutions, though perhaps never perfect ones. The search for tranquility goes on. And now the hour is late. The history has been told. The words are drawing to a close. Let your thoughts slow and soften. Let the narrative fade into the gentle darkness. There is nothing more you need to do tonight, nothing more you need to learn or understand. Simply rest. Simply breathe. The morning will bring its own concerns, but they can wait. Sleep now. The story will be here if you ever need to return to it. The past is always available for contemplation, but this moment, this quiet hour, is for rest. Let it carry you into dreams.